The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session of EduBright University webinar series. Today we are going to discuss about customer onboarding and education for startups. Presenters for this session are going to be Brian Rush and myself Ajay Upadhyay. And quick housekeeping, please post any questions you might have in the chat box anytime during the webinar. We will try to take the questions as they come, and in case we are not able to take them during the webinar, our discussion, we will have some time allocated towards the end of the discussion. So all right, so looking forward to have this session started. Brian, you are going to be driving the session, so yeah, you can take control now.
Thank you, AJ. So in today's discussion, we're going to talk about startups, startup stages, some of the options that they have for training and learning within the environment of a startup, and some of the many benefits of using things early on to incorporate knowledge sharing and community. So with the stages, there's pre-startup and startup. Sometimes those are merged together. Sometimes there's actually another one called seed. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're just going to talk pre-startup, startup, growth, and maturity. And these certainly aren't in a scalar one-to-one proportion. The phases could be longer or shorter in any of these. But these are some of the ideas that happen during each of these phases. And again, they're not they're not necessarily partitioned into any one of these, or they certainly can go across the board. But in the early stages of pre-startup and startup, ideation and incubation and validation are happening, and it's these phases where you're working on your MVP and finding the right niche for your next big thing, and then alpha testing the market readiness for it while you're iterating designs and prototypes. Then you're positioning and validating a scalable product and developing your pitch and demo. Efficiency and scale come in to play mostly during the growth stage, but certainly there are efficiencies that you can start working on earlier in the startup phase. So with the stages, usually pre-startup is when Series A and Series B of the venture capital financing is happening. This is the significant first rounds for the company, and the company must complete a complex transition from one with a great offering that could scale to a company with a great offering that is rapidly and predictably scaling. Series B is more about funding and taking the business to the next level past the development stage. So these early on stages are very critical to avoid the valley of death. But Series C is usually the last VC funding and generally occurs to make the business appealing for acquisition or support for an IPO. So these are all lean times for the business, and that is something that needs to be considered when looking at different items. So from a learning perspective, in the earlier stages, informal learning is highly prevalent, while in the later stages, formal learning starts taking place more in the growth phase. Informal learning certainly never ends, but formal learning will generally start more towards growth, because pre and startup phases are more about less about the tracking the completion of training, and more about just capturing knowledge. So with that, the employee growth is rather exponential. It's very early on stages, pre and startup. Pre-startup is just a skeletal crew, and then startup, you'll start hiring on your critical employees. And then once you get into growth and getting into all of the facets of HR and IT and everything else, that's when it really starts picking up. And then during maturity, it may grow or it may recede a little bit, but employee growth is rather high at the growth stage, of course. And then with the number of employees, if we look at the potential dialogues or interactions between two people during the early stage, where we might have 250 employees, there's potential for 31,000 interactions. And then moving to a stage of 500 employees, that goes to 125,000. And then with 1,000 employees, it goes all the way to 500,000. So the point of this slide is to show that there are many opportunities for a lot of water cooler discussions or community sign-ons where we can have dialogues with each other, or forums or whatever. So there's a lot of opportunity for ideas and exchanging ideas and collaboration, which brings us to information sharing. So with information sharing, you want to develop a culture that encourages the sharing and collaboration early on in the stages. So having the means to do so is providing a medium for a free flow of ideas and information. So you want to document lessons learned and share best practices and minimize the repetitions. Proactively capturing lessons learned of what to continue and what to stop and what to change to continuously improve results. So you want to make sure that this is set up early on, so that during the incubation and ideation stages, people can bounce things off of one another, whether it be remotely through a digital application or just at the water cooler. So that's pretty much what we would call community. So ideation and incubation and validation are all more on the internal side of things. So you could set up an internal community, whereas efficiency and scale happening more in the growth side of things, and more about customer education and the like. That's more on the external side, customer and partner training. But community is just one aspect of a tool set. There are many other facets to consider beyond learning communities, but they vary in relation or relevance to early stage, but can be used throughout the life cycle of the business. So knowledge management is another aspect or a facet to keeping track of a knowledge base, having all of your ideas captured, having all of the FAQs, having how-to guides, things like that are all very important to have documented and at the ready, so that there can be consistent relay of information. With open learning, another aspect or facet of EduBrite, you can use micro-learning videos, which could be just informal SME captures, subject matter expert captures of ideas or proposals, or perhaps an iteration of a prototype, things like that. Webinar recordings, they might be lunch and learns at the early stage, and you capture the recording of that But then later on, of course, when webinar recordings are more appropriate for customers and things like that, they can certainly be used in the later stages as well. And open learning can be user-generated, not necessarily from a learning and development team. Obviously, that wouldn't be happening in the early stages. So having an open forum or an open ability for subject matter experts to share knowledge and generate their own training, or not even training in the literal sense, but sharing. And then content curation is expanding the learning assets to include external content, such as aggregating YouTube videos or TED Talks or things like that, so that they are all congregated in one place. In-app learning, as you're building your prototypes and your minimum viable product, you're probably not going to be doing it at these early stages, but as soon as it comes to time for validation, it would be good to have your product tour in the product itself. So in-app learning is very important. And having contextual help and being able to click on certain things that are relevant to the particular area that the person is working on at that time is extremely important. And then having those tied to the knowledge base that you had implemented earlier on is extremely important as well, so that you can have the application keeping up with changes that are being made as the iterations happen. And for online learning, this is more around e-learning. It's self-paced courses with the option to have reuse the existing content, whether that be from your knowledge base or from the webinars or micro-learning videos, capturing that knowledge and then bringing it more into the formal stage of having an e-learning course. It doesn't have to necessarily be SCORM-based and be tracked. You can have e-learning courses at the early stage where the tracking of completion is less necessary, and then more towards the growth stages when you need to have that for certain formal training, that's going to be available as well. And then likewise for instructor-led training, where it's a live training with an instructor and in person, or a webinar where it could be remote-based and the instructor is on the webinar with the learners remotely. So again, this could be formal or informal in terms of tracking completion, and then making sure that that you're covering all of the bases when you're doing your training. So with this, these items are not necessarily on a continuum from beginning to end, but they can be combined in any order that's necessary for the business at that time. But the important thing is to know that you can start these processes early on, and then keep the content and organize it later on into more of the formal stages if need be. So with that, knowledge sharing needs to be established as part of the culture early on, and then maintained well into the growth stage. So establish that culture, make sure that there's an early adoption of it, and know that the people need to share freely, and that there should be no knowledge hoarding. Everybody should know as much as they can about everything, and keep the culture alive. So in a startup, especially where people wear many hats and they're not necessarily specialized into one role yet, having knowledge of many facets is very important. Adaptability, you want to be in a state of readiness for growth, so that if you have gone through the pre and startup phase and you're getting ready to go into growth, you can take your knowledge base and your micro training and all of that knowledge, and not have to start from scratch necessarily or start from PowerPoint slides, but instead start from the learning that you've created in the system that's not so formal yet, and be able to take that and create formal training from it, so that when it's time for a formalized help or support system, when you've established a customer success department, you can use the knowledge base content, for example, to start your KB for your help application. Scalability, you want to opt for a platform or portal early on that can accommodate scaling with the business throughout all of the stages, so that when you have the early stages completed and you've moved on to the growth stage, you can do those things I mentioned and be able to scale up that content and scale up all of your training as well. So that's pretty much it from a process standpoint. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to AJ at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It was wonderful. Just to add a couple of points. So as Brian mentioned, there are so many facets of learning that the startup needs to consider. Of course, based on your stage, you might not have time and bandwidth and resources to consider all of it at once, but think of what can be what will suit at your stage of the startup, like knowledge base, community, FAQs, having some kind of open learning where just a free form recording of videos can be posted, especially your Q&A sessions with your customers can be recorded, and you can post them in your open learning or a repository of videos which can be used by your other customers as well. So yeah, so those are some of the things which are very useful from the startup perspective, and we are talking about this from the first-hand experience of building EduBright. We are a startup, and we kind of have gone through the similar phases as we talked about today. All right, so please stay connected with us. EduBright user community is a very good place to join, ask any questions, learn about our product, and get help on any other topic that you want to discuss with us. The place to go is university.edubright.com. You'll pretty much find a lot of informative articles, videos, and other resources. Feel free to follow our blog and Twitter handle at EduBright, and we will be posting the recording of this video as well as some of the other webinars. You can always find them on university.edubright.com. So and we will be posting upcoming webinar release information in the email newsletter. So if you are connected, you can easily follow it. All right, so this pretty much concludes this session. Thanks again for joining, and we look forward to you joining us in our next sessions. Thank you all.